Hello and welcome wherever you are to this HEC Paris debate on the US presidential elections. I'm Daniel Brown, the chief editor at HEC Communications Department, as well as being an independent reporter outside of this noble business school. We're recording this exchange at precisely 10 a.m. Paris time on November the 5th, 2020. And in many ways, the time and date have a crucial bearing on our analyses of these elections because rarely has so much uncertainty and suspense surrounded a US presidential election, in this case for the 46th president. As we talk, this is how the situation stands. Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate, has 264 electoral college votes, and we'll come back to very briefly what that means, the electoral college votes, in a moment. And the incumbent Donald Trump of the Republican Party has 50 electoral college votes fewer, that's 214. So very quickly, in terms of the popular votes, it seems to reflect actually that gap, which is not always the case, with a historic record of 71 million votes for Joe Biden, and the third best ever number of votes for Donald Trump, 68 million votes, over the 68 million. And there's still many ballots yet to be counted. We're still waiting for 5 states to finalize their count, and that's Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Alaska. So that's where we stand just now. As I said, a quick word on how the electoral college vote works. So when we Americans, and there are 4 here present, cast our votes, our ballots for the US president, we're actually voting for a representative of that candidate's party known as an elector. There are 538 electors who then vote for the president on behalf of the people in their state. Each state is assigned a certain number of these electoral votes, and that's based on the number of congressional districts they have, plus 2 additional votes representing the state's Senate seats. Washington, D.C., where I and one of my 3 guests here vote, is also assigned 3 electoral votes, despite having no voting representation in Congress, but that's another story. And the vital figure that we're all keeping an eye on is this majority of 270 of these votes that is needed to win the presidency. I'd like to now turn to my 3 participants in today's roundtable. And by the way, there are other votes for the Senate and for the House, but we'll come to that later. First, I'd like to present Megan Scullion. Welcome, Megan, from Geneva. You're an MBA student at HEC. You're going to graduate next year from New York, the New York area, where you studied and worked for 10 years in management in retail, luxury, fashion, and more. There's Jeremy Ghez, who is associate professor and the co-director of the HEC Paris Center of Geopolitics. And you've published, Jeremy, a book in French, which I'll translate the title of, The United States, Improbable Decline, Impossible Rebound. And you're the one who voted with me in Washington, D.C. And finally, I'm pleased to welcome Chantal Carleton. You're the associate professor in the Department of Language and Culture at HEC Paris, with a lot of teaching experience, not only in universities here in France, but also in Indiana University in the United States. And you voted for one of the battlegrounds in the United States that was key to the 2016 presidential election, and that is Florida, which you visited this year. So I'd like to turn, first of all, to you, Jeremy, and ask you first, what is your response to these election results as they stand?
So right now, as you said, 264 electoral votes. The moment we're speaking, it seems as if it might take a little bit more time to figure out. for Joe Biden. It means he has 6 more to go to get elected. It means that basically he would need to win Nevada, which hasn't been called, or Pennsylvania, or Georgia, or North Carolina, one of those 4 states. And it seems as if, the likelihood right now looks a little bit better than the election of Donald Trump. That's what the numbers are telling us. On the other hand, there is no repudiation of Donald Trump, contrary to what some Biden supporters might have hoped for. You see that in some battlegrounds, it was extremely, extremely close. And that in some battlegrounds, such as Florida, Donald Trump, the incumbent president, was able to win it. So it's not a landslide win. And this makes me think this is a country that is extremely, extremely divided, and that no matter who wins, the next president is likely going to have huge tasks in front of him, especially in terms of trying to bring this country back together. And I suspect Donald Trump and Joe Biden have probably different visions on how to do that, but most certainly it's going to be on the table. And the second thing that I'd like to say is that we're going to have to do some soul searching on the poll question. I am not one right now saying that the poll industry is dead. I read that on social media. I don't believe so. It felt as if what we were saying, if you analyze polls quickly, in a thorough way before the election, we knew that if Joe Biden was able to win quickly and without any questions in Pennsylvania and in Florida, this race was a done deal. But if instead it wasn't as clear cut, or if Trump won one of those 2 states, then it was basically 50-50. And this is what happened, and it's exactly what we're living through right now. So, the polls, if you study them, they were giving us a pretty accurate picture of how divided this country was.
The example is perhaps found in Florida, Chantal, Carleton. This is a state which Donald Trump won with actually more votes than, in terms of percentage, than in 2016, 51.2% of the votes compared to 49 4 years ago. Your response in general to this division 50-50 that is reflected, it seems, throughout the United States in 2020?
Exactly as you said, Daniel, this question of not only did Trump win Florida again, but he actually gained a lot more voters. And as Jeremy is saying, we see really this reflection of this polarization, but also in terms of how the structure of voting is constructed in Florida. Obviously, with the 29 electoral votes, Florida is a huge win. But we're also wondering as to how that voting took place, this idea that in Miami-Dade County in the South, we had so much advertising that the Trump campaign was really pushing towards the Latino community. I mean, it was actually starting even at the Republican National Convention when at the first night, Trump had invited Maximo Alvarez, he's a Cuban-born Floridian millionaire, saying that really red baiting, and this was kind of the strategy of the Trump campaign in Florida, saying any vote for the Democrats, any vote for Joe Biden is a vote for communism, is a vote for socialism. And he's saying, with my history, with my family's history, really hearkening back to his origin story in Cuba, is a vote for terror. It's a vote for all of these horrible regimes that we have been living through. So this idea that Trump's strategy, unfortunately, paid off. If we look at how this very cynical and transactional relationship that he has with the Latino voters in Florida specifically, we can also be asking ourselves how not just this ad campaign worked, but also how voting was structured in the United States, specifically in Florida. If we look at how Black and people of colors, their voting mail-in ballots were flagged at twice the amount in states like Florida than for white voters, we have to be asking ourselves the question, the structural issues that are in place and how they played out. Obviously, we still don't have a very clear answer on the 300,000 ballots that have been misplaced or lost. There's a lot of different questions as to how the Postmaster General has essentially repudiated the federal order to be looking for those 300,000 ballots. If we're looking at those ballots, which are really sort of mapped onto Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, all of these missing ballots are from these battleground states. If we look at how mail-in ballots by the Black voters, by people of color in Florida specifically, have been flagged at twice the amount of white voters. That being said, Joe Biden is still able to maintain this lead. So obviously this blue wave that we were hoping for is not necessarily playing out as we had expected, but it's yet overcoming all of these structural issues that have been in place with not just the Electoral College, but in voting in the United States.
Yeah, it seems to be a broken record in many ways in terms of the same questions being posed with acuity 4 years ago, and even going back to 2000, the George Bush against Al Gore election. It was a lot more decisive in the state of New York for one side, and that was Democratic Megan. And there, Joe Biden took 55.5% of the votes. Although that is down again from 2016 when Hillary Clinton won 59% of the vote. And Donald Trump seems to have quite a powerful base even there. Your reaction, Megan, to these results so far?
Yeah, so I lived in New York City for a number of years, and I originally was born and raised in Buffalo, New York. And I think if you look at the data from New York State, you'll see that while New York City is overwhelmingly blue, Buffalo is actually red at the end of the day. So I think that does show that, there is a mix in the state of support. New York is historically very Democratic, always blue. But I think the reality is that Buffalo is a blue collar city, part of the Rust Belt. And I think that there are a lot of people who vote red and who really resonate with the message, this kind of feeling of being left behind, and the feel that Trump speaks to them. So I think that this just goes to show that even in states where there is a very clear Democratic win, that when people are sitting around the dinner table, oftentimes within the same family, you can have people on opposite sides. And I think another good example coming out of the elections are when we look at Congress. So the election between Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and John Cummings was a landslide for AOC, and I think that that also shows kind of the difference between the youth, the new generation coming in, and kind of the old guard. So it's interesting to see that result as well, and kind of could speak to what we might see in the future when the new generation comes up. And then, I think the other piece is just around the election as a whole. I completely echo what Jeremy was saying in that, this race it's still really close, vote by vote. And I think a lot of people in the US were really hoping for some sort of moral victory, in a sense that, all of the issues that are at play right now, that people would go out there and use their voice to vote. And I think that, at least on the Democratic side, when we saw the results probably like midday or early of yesterday, it was a little disheartening, I think, to see that it wasn't more of really a push for people to bring in some new change. But we'll see what happens as they keep counting the votes.
Thank you, Megan. You touched on a lot of issues we'll come back to, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is one of the four called the Squad in in the House, 4 congresswomen who've been a real thorn in the Republican side, and all 4 won again in this vote, quite decisively. I want to turn to a new phenomenon with you, Jeremy, come back to the role of the mail-in and absentee ballots. Since voters have returned a record 64 million mail-in ballots before Election Day, and that's largely, of course, due to the pandemic-driven COVID-19 reality that is certain to mark this year. Some battleground states like North Carolina have been processing ballots for weeks. And just to give an idea of the scale of mail-in balloting this year, doubled from 2016. I mean, is this a sign of the future?
I don't know if it's a sign of the future. I mean, this opens up, I think, a broader debate about how do we live in a world of social distancing. It's true that pandemics end at some point in time, that as hard as it is to imagine at this point right now, they do end at some point in time. I'm not entirely sure that life back to normal is going to be either a possibility or something that citizens and consumers really want. I think that's a really, really open question. And as a result of that, I don't know whether or not we will see this as an accident or as driven primarily by the pandemic and by the need and legitimately need of people to basically protect themselves and vote remotely, or if this is basically the new normal and new trend. I think this is a interesting question to watch for.
Returning to today, if I could, sorry, it's true, a refocus. Many observers have the feeling that in some ways the advances in technology concerning mail-in and concerning even a Zoom meeting like this, which was perhaps unthinkable a dozen years ago, is not followed by the process of counting. And counting has become central in the past 24 hours, where it's still very traditional in many states and not electronically calculated. Your feelings about this imbalance, Jeremy, and then perhaps the other two.
I mean, look, we're talking about a system that has survived for quite some time, a system that is consensual to the extent that there would be absolutely no majority to change it. And I think that we have to be mindful to a large extent of the traditions, I think, that occupy such a meaningful spot in US politics right now. You know, we're going through a period right now in which there are many, many angry people in the United States. And it's true that part of this anger is extremely scary. It goes on fields that I can certainly not adhere to. In terms of racism, in terms of inequalities, both gender, social, racial, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, there is an anger related to, I guess, the discomfort set by globalization and technology as part of the problem. And I don't think that we can impose these types of solutions immediately. So I know that basically many people are asking, how is it that in the country of the Silicon Valley, it takes so much time to do it? On the other hand, glass half full would be to say, look, it's happening. There are incidents that we saw indeed, but they're contained. And there's remarkable stability to a large extent in this democratic system. So I think we have to be mindful of this anger, what got us there, and that the technological part might be placing people in uncomfortable situations that we need to be mindful of.
Megan, maybe I could turn to you as the younger generation. I mean, the young vote actually was something that people were very aware of. CNN called it the year of the young voter, VOA, a record turnout for millennials and Generation Z voters. A real surge, it seems, of voters in all, 20% between 18 and 29. This new technology of mail-in and of electronic counting should be second nature. But more generally, your feelings about this upsurge of interest in the younger generation in terms of this general election, which partly accounts for a record number of votes.
Yeah, I think people are really energized in a way that maybe they weren't in past elections, either because they simply weren't old enough or interested enough in politics, or perhaps because there is just so much emotion wrapped up in this particular election. I hear a lot of, people, my friends, my colleagues, talk, and they're really concerned about the climate. They're really concerned about levels of tolerance in the country, and I think that these issues for them are really tied to their values and their value system. And so I think they feel really motivated to go out there and vote for change. I think there are still some youth vote that Trump has captured, but I do feel that the majority is really for a lot of these more progressive causes like climate change, like the Black Lives Matter, like healthcare. So I think that the younger generation is really they're very unselfish in some ways. They really want to push for a better future, a better planet, a better country. And so I think, they represented, I think, 40% of the potential voice. So that's pretty huge. And I think the ease of voting, it's always the question of, can the young people actually get to the polls, right? We have all these opinions, but then do we actually go out there and vote? And I think technology would definitely be a boon to the youth in terms of ease of voting, if people are able to do it more easily. And I think when I think about that, it's really hard not to touch on the, the feeling that voting should be easier in the United States than it is. So perhaps we're not ready for, technological advances in the election process, but maybe it's something as simple as removing some of the barriers that do exist that are just so cumbersome.
And often manipulated, as Chantal, you alluded to earlier. Chantal, you're regularly in touch with the younger generations that you've been teaching over the years. So do you feel, a study showed recently that 7 million more young have a history of voting more than in 2016. So there is this growing consciousness that Megan was referring to. And the activism also of groups like Black Lives Matter seems to also have awakened their political conscience. The Wisconsin representative David Bowen credited the win for the Democrats to the activism of Black Lives Matter and of the youth. Your feelings about this element of the vote in the presidential campaign, elections?
As Megan pointed out, this question of engagement, and one could see this as the silver lining of what has been happening over the past couple of years, this idea that a lot of the CNN exit polls asking either the Biden or Trump supporters, what were your main concerns? For Biden supporters, the first concern was the issue of racial justice. This was diametrically opposed to what the Trump supporters were saying was the economy. The economy overcame issues of healthcare, the pandemic, et cetera. So this idea that if racial justice has become such a flashpoint, we can really, I think, be calling upon ourselves to ask how voting is structured in a very specific way. So yes, we're dealing with issues of technology versus tradition, but we're also looking at who or what groups of voices does the administration want to be heard? Because we're not looking only at a question of how technology could have helped, but we're also looking at the Trump administration not allowing Pennsylvania to start counting the absentee or the mail-in ballots until election day. So the question is like, why is Pennsylvania taking so long? Oh, it must be a question of technology. Actually, no, these are structural issues that the Trump campaign foresaw Pennsylvania being such a battleground state much more than in the past. So therefore was hoping to suppress the mail-in ballots, thinking that, as we saw, that they would be skewed more democratically. So all of these questions, I think, have been giving us, or giving especially the younger generation, this question of this moment of reckoning, really, that James Baldwin had mentioned many years ago, that this could be really the moment finally for us to be looking at our own ugly history, to be recognizing that there is a value gap in the United States in which there's a clear value placed on white lives more than on Black lives. We see this in very many instances. The Minnesota governor, after the murder, the death of Philando Castile, had said if Philando Castile had been white, he would be alive today. So I think this question of reckoning, of activism in the younger generation, but really across the board, if we're looking at the different concerns that are important to Biden supporters, Trump supporters, that this can be what Van Jones and Megan, you alluded to, this, okay, we are having perhaps a political victory, but maybe not the moral victory that the Democrats were hoping for. That on the contrary, we are seeing these signs of awakening, of engagement that I think are extremely positive.
Let me bring in another crucial factor in terms of these elections, and that is the role of the COVID-19 crisis, both in terms of health and in terms of the economy, as the number of victims continue to spike up. And we had a world record yesterday, and right in the middle of the voting being counted, over 100,000 new cases and over 1,000 people who died. Many of the worst cases being the 17 states where Trump won, interestingly enough. And yet it seems that in terms of those areas, those states, the preoccupation of the economy is greater for a lot of the voters than the worries and concerns over the health and well-being of the population. Jeremy, you actually described a tale of two economies recently, where the COVID was a crucial turning point in terms of a steady economic growth pattern that lasted over 120 months, a record during the Trump presidency. And this COVID-19 factor changed a lot. How present was that in the minds of the voters when they went to cast their votes?
Well, I mean, it depends which ones. Longest expansion in U.S. history, 128 months, 8 longer than the previous record. That ended officially in February, because recessions are called in the United States by the NBER, who's officially responsible for identifying the turning points. When you look at a poll,
we've lost Jeremy just for a moment. We'll get back to that. Megan, perhaps, Jeremy, you've come back. Are you with us again?
I got cut off.
Pick up? No problem.
I got cut off.
As you were saying.
I am not paranoid, and I am not going to speculate on who tried, to cut my intranet at the key moment. So 128 months. Yes, roughly a third of the population, according to the Financial Times, was saying just before the election that the economy and that their economic state was actually better than 4 years ago. Roughly a third of the population was saying the exact opposite, and roughly a third of the population was basically saying something in between, didn't know, or roughly the same. So we have again an image of that division. So to get back to your point and to your question, what was interesting, I think, was basically you had really two tales, as you said. One who basically, a set of voters basically saying, look, before the pandemic, the economy was going strong. This isn't a recession caused by bad economic fundamentals. It's a recession caused by the decision to lock down the economies worldwide. So to some extent, when you look at, how I'm doing economically speaking, I'm actually doing better, thanks to what? They would quote fiscal reform 2017, deregulation, and that basically means, this is the type of expectations I have. Fine, Donald Trump is not Barack Obama. It's not he's not a Dwight Eisenhower or Winston Churchill, but he gets the job done. That's what the Pittsburgh Gazette said over the weekend, endorsing President Trump after saying we endorsed Barack Obama twice in 2008 and 2012. It's pragmatism pushed to an extreme. So that's one tale of the US economy. The other tale was to say, look, I mean, we're approaching, not yet, but unfortunately it seems as if we're going to get there fast. The 250,000 deaths related to COVID. To give you a rough idea, that's 25 times the number of casualties when you add 9/11, the war in Afghanistan, and the war in Iraq. And we know how significant the legacy of those two wars and that attack was in contemporary US history, right? The same way, we're approaching very quickly the ultimate number of casualties in the Second World War. So this is quite something for a lot of generations who really feel that this pandemic was badly managed by Washington and by Donald Trump. So this influenced, I guess, economic perspectives. It basically led a lot of them to say, we're in a recession and employment is going up, and basically there are probably 5 million jobs that are never coming back. So again, we are in this very polarized environment, deep divisions, and depending on who you ask, part of them will say, yes, but this was just an accident of history, bad luck, and things will pick up again. And, the entrepreneurs, I'm not talking about the ideological vote here, but the entrepreneurs, the people who believe, I guess, in free markets or not, or the people who just want to go with their business and not have, not express the need for true leadership or true leader at the head of the White House. Well, basically, they voted for Donald Trump and they had no problem doing it. Those who believe that, you can't think economy long run without having a sense of leadership, without a sense of vision, and felt that they were failed by the management of this crisis, had a lot of other things to say and had a very different narrative of the past 9 or 10 months.
Let's turn to that 128 months briefly, and Chantal and Megan, perhaps you could respond in terms of the Biden campaign saying, well, it was the Obama administration and Biden was the vice president who laid the foundations for this prosperity, and that Trump just caught the ball as it was going up and moved it further forward. Your response? Chantal, let's begin with you.
This question, obviously, I think the important issue here is narrative and how information is getting out, whether it's the question of, obviously, I think Jeremy can speak much more eloquently to the question of the economy than I can, but the idea that who is deciding, okay, whether it's Obama Foundation, whether it's Trump's work, the idea here is the importance of, I think what Jeremy was just saying, the crucial idea of leadership and how we can have faith in that leadership. And we're seeing so many times now that the truth, obviously the hashtag fake news that has become almost a joke now, but the idea of how much faith we can be placing in our representative and our civil servants, in the people that we hire for these jobs, the idea that truth has become politicized, but also in the question of how the pandemic has affected the economy, how science as well has become politicized, the idea of how this administration has managed or mismanaged the pandemic. We're seeing ideas of how the pandemic was trying to be monetized as well through the Trump administration, with either the withholding of N95 masks, the US shipping those masks out as opposed to keeping it for our healthcare workers. This idea that this is a significant issue of what narrative is being laid out, how we're coming to understand behind the scenes. And I think that's going to be calling upon ourselves to ask a lot more questions, both of our electorate, of our elected officials. The idea that Megan alluded to earlier, that there are all these hopeful signs. We had the highest turnout since 1900. So I think that we are, the electorate, whether it's getting younger, whether it's becoming more informed, all of these signs are very hopeful that we can get to some clearer answers, I think.
Megan, you were involved for several years, over a dozen or 10 years on building brand equity, for example, in 30 plus countries and working in the business. How do you see the economic question in terms of Trump's legacy and in terms of its impact in these elections?
Sure. I always think of a quote by Bernard Arnault, famous Frenchman, head of LVMH Group. And after the 2008-2009 crisis, he was quoted saying that he's planning his business assuming that these types of recessions are cyclical and that they tend to happen around every 10 years. So I think looking through it from a business lens, it's not necessarily surprising that we did find ourselves in another downturn. I think the fact that it was coronavirus, COVID-19 caused was certainly a surprise. And I think in terms of the U.S. and the economy and what this means, I think, I really see how a lot of people are really, rallying around Trump because they do feel that he has been the one who's led this expansion. I think the reality is that it probably did start as part of the recovery from the 2008-2009 crisis, and that's just kind of how these things evolve again over that 10-year spectrum. And I think that we also have to look at the quality of the unemployment that we have in the United States. So, when we look at this low unemployment rate before COVID hit, how many Americans were working 2 part-time jobs, making minimum wage, I think it was $7 an hour when I was working, and that was over 10 years ago, and now it's only $9. So I think then when you put that in the context of, yes, okay, these people aren't unemployed, they're productive members of society, but when they were getting the stimulus checks as part of the COVID-19 relief, there were some people who were saying, I'm actually better off because I'm getting more money in my pocket. So I think there is this real tension between the people who believe that deregulation and trickle-down economics work, and then the people who are really out there, again, working these jobs and not seeing it materialize. So I think, America needs to find a balance. We don't want to crush innovation. We don't want people to stop following and pursuing the American dream. But I think at the same time, there's statistically proof that the inequality divide has grown. So we have to, again, find some way to find a balance. And I guess the last point I'll say is, in terms of the manufacturing jobs, so a lot of, if you look back at the beginning of the modern times, a lot of manufacturing was happening in the United States, and we've seen that progressively move overseas. And I think a lot of people's frustration, and these are a lot of the people who are supporting Trump, they haven't been retrained. They haven't been given other viable alternatives to make, the same type of living that they saw their parents and grandparents have. And then you have the millennials who are completely disenfranchised by the fact that we've had 2 severe recessions. We're taking longer to get married, not buying property, not having kids. So there's just all these questions, and we're leaning more towards 2 extremes. And I think we need to, this again, I see the task for whoever wins the election is to, how do we bring people to the middle, and how do we find some balance?
Thank you. Before we move on to the Senate and House votes, and I'm hoping also that we'll have time to discuss the foreign relations and foreign policy visions of the 2 candidates to the presidential spot. So, final question about the profiles of the voters, and I thought you might be interested in responding to the statistics that have come out already about who has been voting for which candidate. In Michigan, for example, I read that it's for Biden, it's been primarily women, 57% against 43% for Trump, and That's they represent 55% of the voters. Huge majority of the Black population, 89% voted for Biden against 43% of the white votes, which represented 4/5 of the votes. Also strong representation for the Hispanics, 59% voted for Biden, and then the youth. Pennsylvania, very similar kind of profile. So these are two battleground states. To give you specifics, 56% of the women in Pennsylvania voted for Biden. 92% of the Black population, 69% of the Hispanic and Latino population, and 61% of the young. Jeremy, is that representative?
It's hard to say, and I think that we'll need to dive into the numbers once they're definitive and in comparison, I guess, countrywide. And I think it would be an interesting exercise to try to understand, you know, what's the Trump coalition really look like. Was this a real referendum against Donald Trump? In which case, you know, any candidate would have been a good one, which I'm not entirely sure that's the case, and that I'm not entirely sure that's truth. But it's true that this coalition is shaping to start to look like, I guess, a little bit the Obama coalition that we wrote and discussed so much about in 2008 and 2012. What also occurs to me is, you know, back in late September, about 60% of American citizens believed that if Joe Biden was to be elected, this would be a one-term president. And I think that what is interesting with this is that usually you don't get excited, you don't get motivated for a one-term president. And yet these numbers certainly suggest the opposite, and certainly suggest that some demographic groups certainly got excited, even if there is, I mean, let's not lie, there is that presumption that there is a possibility that Biden might not be even going through that first term if he doesn't get elected. I think there's a real debate over, you know, the type of leadership that it will take to reconcile a country as a whole. I think Obama had part of what it took. I think that he ultimately faced a lot of opposition in Congress, and probably was, I guess, the figure that didn't go to full reconciliation. What's interesting about Joe Biden is that he has all of this experience in the Senate. He has all of this experience of being, to some extent, in his own way, a populist, in a sense of being very close to people, in the sense of being able to address a wide range of constituencies. And again, the numbers you talked about certainly suggest that. And I wonder, is this the type of recipe, the type of transition you might need to reconcile this country going down the line? Maybe. But that's going to take a lot of political savviness, a lot of societal savviness, and it's not crystal clear to me what the path is, because a broad coalition is good, but then ultimately it's not on that coalition that you can rely only to reconcile a country. It has to be the electorate as a whole, and that's going to be a really defining question for coming months and coming years.
Wow, so many points we could discuss in your answer. Thank you. One thing you didn't touch, and I'd like to perhaps turn to both Megan and Chantal for this, and that is the fact that the women seem to strongly have changed camp in these two examples. And again, of course, Jeremy, you're absolutely right that this is just two amongst the 50 states. And but I thought they're interesting since they were really divided down the middle. But is this also a war of sexes? Is it also divided down the middle in terms of white male voters and women and minorities on the other side? And has that evolved in the last 4 years? And what you brought up, Jeremy, about it quite possibly being a one-term presidency, is that the person, right, under right next to him will be Vice President Kamala Harris, who's not quite half his age, but could be his daughter. Chantal.
It's an excellent question, and I think the flashpoint word that Jeremy used is this idea of reconciliation. Today's op-ed piece by Charles Blow in the New York Times, like the title is very significant. The exit polls point to the power of white patriarchy was his title that he chose, and the idea that, and these are exit polls, again, they're not polls that are taken from mail-in ballots, obviously, but that 3 out of every 5 white voters are Trump voters. So this question of this reckoning and this question of reconciliation, as Jeremy is saying, that has to be coming from the electorate itself, this idea of division, which is so deeply entrenched when we're looking at what are the issues that matter in terms of racial justice. We have many voices in the Black Lives Matter movement who are asking us to call into question when Joe Biden, when people are reacting to, for example, the shooting in El Paso, Texas, when the shooter had the manifesto, which was clearly based on Trump's speeches of talking about the foreign invasion and how we're being overrun by people of color. And when Joe Biden, when other people of privilege are able to say, this is not my America, it's a question of saying, actually, this has been America for hundreds of years. So the opportunity that we could be at, if there is the courage to do so, is to be really asking ourselves the tough questions. Are we willing to make the substantive changes that are reflected in obviously very real situations of how policing is conducted in the United States, to questions of voter activism and voter rights? The idea here is this is a very powerful and potentially optimistic moment. I would like us to, remember that at this moment that, as you mentioned, Daniel, at the very beginning, the 4 members of the squad have been reelected in landslide victories. Obviously, I know you wanted to talk about the Senate, but maybe Megan would like to answer also or talk to this question about how racial justice will be so significant, but the idea of this referendum that we were looking for, how the Senate and the House either are losing seats or gaining seats. The Democrats lost 5 seats, the Republicans, we gained 6 seats. So this idea that there's this back and forth, that we're not necessarily going to come to this moment of consensus, but I still hope that it could still be a moment of reconciliation if we're really, again, willing to look at what are the deeper causes of this.
Megan, your response to both what's just been said by Jeremy and Chantal, and the profile that I suggested, which again is just almost a straw poll and not nationwide. Megan.
Yeah, I think the topic of gender within the election is really interesting. I think I had seen a study that was saying that about 50% of white women had voted for Trump in the last campaign or the last election, and now it was up to 55%. And people were a little surprised by that, wondering why even more women would vote for someone who has had so many, question marks on his profile. And I think, there is this idea of the patriarchy that I think a lot of women I think still buy into in a lot of ways. There's this quote by Aviva Whittington Cox, and she is CEO of one of the leading gender equality companies. And she said that for my mother, for instance, her grandmother got the vote, she got the pill, and I got a great education. So I think we're seeing progress being made, but when I think about someone like my mother's generation going to the polls, I think they still very much came up in an environment where sexual harassment was not, the Me Too movement had not happened. A lot of women were, if they're experiencing this, then they're kind of told, well, it must have been your fault. You must have asked for this. And I think that when you have that sort of environment, that, it's very easy to continue kind of operating with those beliefs. I think also for a lot of people with Trump, the idea of abortion rights and healthcare, I think those are key. key issues for them, and they will stick with whoever is pushing for those, regardless of whoever their profile is. And then I think there's also with the patriarchy, this idea of the machismo, of this, like, you know, what it means to be a man and be manly. And I think Biden and Trump really, you know, represent two different ideas of that, right? So Trump is very, you know, in your face, I'm a man, let me show you how manly I can be. And I think that resonated a lot with the women who maybe do still find themselves under, you know, this more like traditional patriarchy belief system. And I think that's also why he was able to garner so much of the Latino vote, looking at like Miami, for instance, where, you know, he really connected with them on that. Yeah, so that's where I'm thinking.
Thank you, thank you. Let's turn now to the balance of power, and that means looking at Congress and who's controlling it. There are still some races going on. For example, in the Senate, 31 of the 35 races have been called, so 4 are still outstanding, and they could be crucial because there again, we are in a fine balancing act where both Democrats and Republicans have 48 seats each, and in the House, there's been quite a loss and quite a surprise, I think, in terms of what people were forecasting, in that the Democrats, after a very strong midterm showing, have lost 5 seats and the Republicans have gained 6. So nevertheless, the Democrats are still 14 seats ahead, 204 against 190, but they need 218 before they would have a majority. Jeremy, your response to these elections?
Yeah, so the projections overall suggest that the Democrats are going to keep the House, and it is rather likely that the Republicans will keep the Senate. This has a few ramifications. So as Chantal and Megan pointed out, there are many people who are getting reelected, so a lot of familiar faces. There's the squad in the House. In the Senate, again, back to the theme of no repudiation of Trump in the United States. Mitch McConnell in Kentucky, Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, who were steadfast allies of President Trump. Many opponents to President Trump promised those two people many fights to get them to lose their bid for re-election uphill. Well, they got re-elected in an undeniable way, meaning again no repudiation of Donald Trump. We see those themes again in Congress as well. The other implication of this, I think, is that if this is a Joe Biden presidency, and again at this hour it looks like the likelier outcome of this election, it means that you're still going to have a president facing a divided Congress, and a president who will need to work very closely with Congress in order to get many things done. So to give you a couple of examples that I found interesting and important. So you look at the green initiatives in Joe Biden's platform. That is actually a huge amount of money devoted to green initiatives, $2 trillion. It goes beyond what Obama had imagined. What is interesting about this ambition is that the president of the United States, as powerful as he may be, will not be able to do this all by himself. So he's going to have to go negotiate in Congress. And be careful, because I don't think all Democrats are going to subscribe to that immediately, especially those in swing districts of the House, especially those senators up for re-election in a couple of years. This is nothing obvious. So you're going to have to see a lot of negotiations. That being said, Joe Biden is a guy who knows, again, the Senate very well. He knows how it works. So he might have a little bit room for maneuver. The second example that I find interesting is on the question of the Supreme Court. So as we know, there's now somewhat of a different balance on the Supreme Court. 6 conservative judges against 3 named by Democrats. there has been this whole conversation about court packing, namely saying, look, there's a possibility that we add judges on the Supreme Court in order to rebalance the Supreme Court. Joe Biden has addressed this point in a way that I find very interesting, which is basically the risk of doing that. So first and foremost, there is the legality issue, which is huge. And students of history of the 1930s know what happened to Franklin Roosevelt when he tried that. But he says something even more striking to me. It's running the risk of making the Supreme Court even more political than it is, or addressing the risk of politicization of the Supreme Court with further pushing it even further down the political road. And he said there is an alternative to all of this, which is basically legislating and legislating and legislating, because the Supreme Court basically can't go against the laws of the land and what has been voted by Congress. And this is extremely interesting because it means here too, what happens between Congress and the executive branch is going to be central in months and years to come on those two issues, the green transition and the Supreme Court. And I'm sure there are many other issues, but I found those two issues quite striking in the recent public debate.
Thank you. Perhaps we could turn to Chantal concerning what seems a dichotomy, that's the more locally based elections on the ground, such as the ones we see for the House, where you have 435 seats and they're very local campaigns, seem to have swung, or the momentum that was building up for the Democrats slowed down 2 years later in these votes, and to a lesser extent with the Senate, where there has been a slight shift towards the Democrats, but very slight.
Very slight indeed, Daniel. This idea that it's only one seat gained in the Senate for the Democrats with one loss for the Republicans. It's really in the House, like you're saying, in these local elections, which 6 seats were gained by the Republican Party. And again, going back to this idea of repudiation, which Jeremy has brought up, this idea that it's very easy for us to say that once Trump is replaced, if the Joe Biden presidency occurs, that this moment in history, or the American moment, will be over. However, it's not Trump. Many commentators, especially the Princeton professor Eddie Glaude, saying that this is Trumpism, this idea that it's not just a question of a person, and to scapegoat the president is extremely facile for us. We can take ourselves off the hook by saying that this is localized in one person. But we're seeing in the loss of 5 seats in the House for the Democrats that this is actually not. This is a phenomenon of perhaps which Trump is or was a symptom. But again, this moment of what does this mean for us as an electorate, I think is very, very telling in this loss of, as you're saying, the momentum for either the blue wave, for the House, if we're looking at also how Americans feel comfortable with the balance of power with the 3 branches of government. Do we want gridlock? Do we want this, checked level of power? Is perhaps a structural issue, which we can go into, but the idea of specifically speaking to this local level of the loss of seats speaks to a larger issue of how Trump and Trumpism is not just a localized moment, which won't go away, as he has promised himself as well. Even if he loses the White House, he promises to stay around to make noise. And this is, again, echoing and having a lot of resonance for people, which we need to be looking at.
Time is moving on apace, so I'd like to turn to our final subject of exchange and start with you, Megan. And given that we are from HEC Paris in the heart of France, I'd like to ask you to give your vision of American foreign policy in the coming years and bring out your crystal ball. And let's start with the European Union. Clearly has been tired of being, I think, Washington, D.C.'s junior partner. And there is a reality should Biden take the vote. He is a transatlantist, very proud transatlanticist, very proud of his roots in Ireland. And to build on what Jeremy said earlier in terms of his green initiative, $2 trillion, one of the things he might well do immediately is to repeal the decision to leave the Paris Climate Agreement, which actually took place yesterday. The other thing is reinstating the United States in the World Health Organization, but we'll move, let's focus on the EU. The relationships between Europe and the United States has taken quite a battering in the past 4 years. Your feelings about that and what Biden could bring?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of his strengths is definitely foreign policy. So there's no question about that. I think with the traditional American allies, the EU and Europe being one of them, we have seen that kind of fraying at the fringes over the last 4 years. I think Trump has not made it so clear that that those are the ties that we're really going to prioritize. And I think Biden has definitely said, that it would look similar to what he has done in the past with much of his foreign policy rules. So I think in Europe, having lived here now for a year, I think it's much more social. It's much more progressive in terms of climate and different actions that the different countries are taking. And so I think that if we have a Biden presidency, ideally I would like to see the US playing a greater role, being a better partner. And I think that what we've seen with Trump kind of taking a backseat to some of these issues, or trying to be a little bit America first and a little isolationist, is that the world moves on. So America has traditionally been a leader of sorts in some of these conversations. But I think the world is going to move on, and especially just looking at climate, I think we saw China and Japan step up with their carbon neutral goals in the near future. I think the EU is already making, and the UK as well, making huge moves towards that. And so it really seems at this moment in time that America is kind of falling to the back. And I think that if Biden is elected, then we have a chance to start moving forward in that direction that the rest of the world is going in. And one other point I want to make, being an MBA student at one of the top global MBA programs, our program is 92% diversity on average. This idea of global business and globalization and this interdependency across countries is not going to end. It's the future. It's here and now. So, the stance that Trump has taken to me feels a little bit like we're afraid of change. And I really think that if you look at anything, technology, whatever it is, it's usually better to embrace it. And try and figure out how you can excel in it. And so I think America would benefit from changing its current stance.
Chantal, a study recently showed that Europe has lost the trust in the United States, and certainly the EU President Ursula von der Leyen hopes for a more revitalized multilateral system, and therefore needs Biden for this. As Megan was saying, traditionally the United States has been very involved in multilateral exchanges, and in the last 4 years has been pretty counter-current to that. Your feelings about EU and European relationships under potentially a Biden presidency?
I think the idea that even the idea of optics of how even this decision of moving away from, as Megan says, the isolationism, this fear that Trump has instilled for foreign relations, that the move from a Trump administration to a Biden administration, that alone, the shift and the power of that perception from the United States into the world can have huge ramifications for that alone. If we think about how much cultural capital the United States has had just in the idea of its soft power throughout the world, and how much of a loss we've had in the past 4 years because of Trump's isolationist policies, that we can really imagine a different moment, a different historical moment with just the idea of Biden's openness and willingness to reopen those channels, to reintegrate on the national and international stage of how the United States is going to be perceived. Just looking at how my students are just asking those questions of like, how is this possible that has lasted so long? And the idea that the United States, having lost its standing, if we're looking at the admissions of international students in the United States, even before COVID, dropping so many percentage points, the idea that the United States was this mecca for which to go, whether for education or otherwise, having lost its hold, as Megan was saying, that I think a Biden administration can be sending a different signal to the world, even just on optics, even before foreign policy stances get implemented.
However, Jeremy, it's, I think, not going to be a smooth, idealistic transition towards a wonderful honeymoon between the two. It's been relatively absent, the discussions about trade relations with one of the United States' biggest partner, of course. And Biden is not, I think, going to ignore the calls that's supported Trump so much, and that is, United States first and so on. There's clearly a feeling that they want a stronger economy, more locally based in the population. And for example, the tariff rise on cars, I believe Biden might well want to impose and or to implement, and then that could well be the first sticking points between him and his EU partners. So one thing is unquestionably the style, and Biden has very close advisors that are very well versed in Europe. There's a lot of talk about his top advisors, Tony Gardner and Tony Blinken, being amongst the closest advisors for EU policy. Your feelings about how it could map out? Again, he's not the president yet, but let's imagine.
So, I mean, it would be wrong indeed to think that there will be a new honeymoon. It would be even worse to think that basically, all is good and we go back to normal. There is no new or at least there is a new normal, and back to what it was isn't going to happen. I think many Europeans are waking up to this very uneasy and yet crucial and critical feeling that they're the senior partner in this transatlantic relationship now. They're the ones who will need to basically grab America by the hand and start basically rebuilding and rethinking what the post-pandemic world should look like, especially from international governance standpoint, and from the standpoint of international organizations, the WTO probably being the most important one. I don't know whether Europe wants to take on that task. I don't know if they think they have the means, the political means, the financial means to do it. What I do know is that if Europe doesn't do it, it can keep on, complaining about the state of this transatlantic relationship, but it's not going to change anything about the state of this relationship. And this isn't even about Donald Trump. Barack Obama would come to EU summits, have 28 different people around the table, scratch his head and ask, what are we doing here? I don't understand who I'm talking to. So this is a very long-term trend, very long-term in the sense that it goes beyond Donald Trump. And it's something that I think Europeans should really be thinking about and working on in terms of saying there's huge risks involved. Because, in global governance, we say, yes, there's always a pilot in the plane unless there's no one in the plane, what we call the G0 world. If we want to avoid that, then I think it's time for the Europeans to understand their strengths and understand that there is a huge boulevard that just opened up a little bit of time ago. It's still opened up, and maybe a Joe Biden presidency would allow them to think about, what could they construct, but they're certainly going to need to play the more senior role in this relationship.
Yes, interesting times and challenging. I was reading recently an article by the former Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, about this idea that the international community will welcome into their orbits the United States as saviors of the liberal international order after the 4 years of chaos under President Trump. And he warned, however, that this is going to be very difficult. A Biden victory would, he said, offer the temptation of seeking to restore the United States post-Cold War image of itself as a virtuous hegemon, but that would badly underestimate the country's current predicaments, which of course is reflected in this ongoing election. My thanks to all three of you for exchanging for over an hour on so many of these subjects. I think we've covered a lot of terrain, and I hope to meet you again in 3 years' time, 4 years' time, as we did 4 years ago, to discuss the highly interesting and very debatable American politics and presidential elections. Thank you very much.